Right now, as you're watching this, scientists studying Yellowstone are dealing with more new information about this volcano than they've had access to in years. All of it is arriving within months of each other in a genuinely unusual convergence. A section of the caldera's north rim rose by a full inch across an area of roughly 19 square miles, then stopped completely. A hydrothermal explosion just tore through Biscuit Basin for the second time in roughly 2 years. The park's most famous geyser is producing a fraction of the eruptions it was putting out just a few years ago. And a brand new study published this year in the respected journal Science has completely redrawn scientists' understanding of where Yellowstone's magma is actually coming from. None of this means an eruption is coming anytime soon. The math on that remains exactly as reassuring as it's always been. But taken together, this is a volcano that scientists are understanding in a genuinely new way right now. And today, we're going to break down exactly what's driving each of these developments. If you want to stay on top of this as new research and monitoring data come in, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we track Yellowstone constantly. Let's get into it. Let's start with the story that got the most public attention over the past year. Beginning in July 2025, continuous GPS monitoring stations along the north rim of Yellowstone caldera began detecting ground uplift. By the time it was widely reported, the affected area had risen by roughly an inch across approximately 19 square miles. That's an area researchers compared to roughly 279 football fields in size. For a stretch of months, this uplift kept climbing steadily, drawing genuine public attention and no small amount of concern about what a rising supervolcano caldera might mean. Then, according to the U.S. Geological Survey's own tracking, the uplift ceased by mid-January 2026. Deformation measurements since then have shown no significant additional uplift or subsidence of either the caldera or the north rim specifically. The bulge rose, held, and then simply stopped. Michael Poland, the geophysicist serving as scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, offered a characteristically measured response to the whole episode. He described it as pretty stunning, even if it's not particularly unusual, a distinction worth sitting with, because both halves of that sentence are true simultaneously. It's genuinely impressive, visible, measurable ground movement across a huge area. And it's also something Yellowstone has done multiple times before within recorded monitoring history. This exact same section of the North Rim experienced a similar uplift episode between 1996 and 2004, an event lasting close to 8 years. Zoom out further, and the caldera saw uplift of roughly 28 inches across various sections between the 1920s and the early 1980s. And another episode between 2004 and 2010 that produced roughly 10 inches of rise in some areas. Poland's working explanation for what's driving this particular episode centers on the accumulation and withdrawal of magma sitting roughly 9 miles beneath the surface. That specific depth matters enormously for how concerned this should make anyone. If an actual eruption were building toward the surface, the deformation signature would look meaningfully different, shallower, faster, and paired with a very different pattern of seismicity than what's actually been recorded here. While the uplift story was playing out on the North Rim, a different part of the park delivered its own headline. On June 13, 2026, a small hydrothermal explosion occurred at Biscuit Basin, roughly 100 to 200 feet north of a feature called Black Diamond Pool. The event was well recorded by seismic and acoustic monitoring equipment already in place in the basin, and it threw rocks several meters into the air before discharging. This wasn't Biscuit Basin's first incident either. The basin has been closed to visitors since an earlier, more disruptive hydrothermal explosion. Poland's assessment following this most recent event was blunt. The reopening of Biscuit Basin remains unlikely in 2026. He described the activity at Black Diamond Pool, specifically, as decidedly unpredictable, which is worth understanding in proper context. Hydrothermal explosions at Yellowstone are not magmatic eruptions. They're driven by superheated water and steam trapped beneath a cap of rock or sediment, building pressure until it releases suddenly and violently at the surface. Sometimes ejecting rock, mud, and boiling water with real force without any molten rock reaching the surface at all. They're genuinely hazardous to anyone standing too close when one occurs, which is exactly why Biscuit Basin has stayed closed. But they are a fundamentally different category of hazard than a volcanic eruption, driven by shallow hydrothermal plumbing rather than the deep magmatic system that defines Yellowstone's supervolcano classification. Here's a detail that's gotten far less attention than the uplift or the explosion, but that scientists studying the park's geothermal features find genuinely notable. Steamboat Geyser, the tallest active geyser in the world, has been dramatically winding down. At its most active, Steamboat produced 48 eruptions across 2019 and 2020 combined, an extraordinary pace for a geyser famous for being wildly unpredictable, sometimes going years between major eruptions before entering an active period. In 2025, that number dropped to just 3 eruptions for the entire year, Its most recent major eruption occurred at 10:02 p.m. on December 31st, 2025, marking a gap of 261 days since the eruption before it. For Poland, this pattern reads as a clear signal that Steamboat is winding down after one of its periodic active phases. This is part of the same unpredictable rhythm that has always defined the geyser's behavior, rather than any indication of a broader shift in the volcanic system underneath the park. It's worth understanding why a change in geyser behavior gets folded into a story about the supervolcano at all. Yellowstone's geysers, hot springs, and hydrothermal features are all surface expressions of the same underlying heat source, ultimately the volcanic and magmatic system beneath the park, even when a specific geyser's on and off cycle doesn't correlate directly with deeper magmatic activity. Watching how these surface features behave over time gives scientists an additional complementary window into the broader system, even when, as appears to be the case here, a particular feature's slowdown reflects its own internal plumbing quirks rather than a change happening miles below. Now here's the development I think matters most. For understanding why new phase is a genuinely fair way to describe where Yellowstone science stands right now, rather than just clickbait framing. In July 2026, a research team from the Institute of Geology and Geophysics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences published a study in the journal Science. That study built a complete three-dimensional model of the entire western North American mantle. Using that model, the team came back with findings that meaningfully redraw where scientists believe Yellowstone's magma supply actually originates. This is not a minor technical footnote buried in an academic journal that nobody outside the field will ever read. For decades, the working model of Yellowstone centered on a relatively simple vertical mantle plume. That plume is a column of unusually hot material, rising more or less straight up from deep within the earth and feeding the volcanic system above it. This new research examines the tectonic origin of what researchers are calling Yellowstone's translithospheric magma plumbing system. It suggests the actual pathway connecting Yellowstone to its deep heat source is considerably more complex and shaped significantly by the tectonic history of the surrounding region. This is more complex than the simple vertical plume model most people have heard described in documentaries and textbooks for years. Alongside this reworked mantle model, researchers, applying artificial intelligence tools to decades of existing seismic data, have identified tens of thousands of previously undetected earthquakes in the Yellowstone region. These are events too small or too subtle for older detection methods to have flagged, sitting hidden in plain sight within data that had already been collected. That's a genuinely significant methodological development. It means scientists now have access to a vastly more detailed catalog of the park's actual seismic behavior than existed even a few years ago, without needing to install a single new piece of monitoring equipment. They simply got dramatically better at reading the data they already had. And to understand why Yellowstone behaves so differently from a typical volcano, it helps to understand the specific geological mechanism sitting underneath the park, and why episodes like this one don't map cleanly onto the mental image most people have of a volcano building toward an eruption. Yellowstone sits above what geologists call a hotspot, a persistent plume of unusually hot material rising from deep within the mantle. This plume is largely independent of the boundaries between tectonic plates that produce most of the world's volcanic activity. Unlike a typical subduction zone volcano, where magma forms relatively predictably as one plate grinds beneath another, a hotspot represents a fixed source of heat. The North American continent has been slowly drifting over the fixed heat source for millions of years. That's part of why a trail of ancient calderas stretches across the Snake River Plain in Idaho, marking the hotspot's former positions as the continent moved over it. Yellowstone represents simply where that same hotspot happens to sit right now. This geological setup means Yellowstone's surface behavior, its geysers, hot springs, mud pots, and periodic ground deformation, is driven by an enormous, deep, and remarkably persistent heat source. This is rather than a single, discrete magma body building toward a specific eruption the way a stratovolcano like Mount St. Helens does. That distinction is a major part of why Yellowstone can produce dramatic-sounding surface phenomena, a 19-square-mile bulge, a violent hydrothermal explosion, a famous geyser suddenly falling quiet. None of those events necessarily indicate the kind of buildup that precedes an actual eruption. The hotspot's heat has to go somewhere, and the huge, complex hydrothermal plumbing system beneath the park is constantly redistributing that heat and pressure. That redistribution produces exactly the kind of varied, unpredictable surface activity this video has covered, largely independent of whatever the deep magma chamber itself happens to be doing at any given moment. The Biscuit Basin event this June is far from an isolated incident in Yellowstone's history. Understanding that broader pattern helps put this particular explosion in proper context. Yellowstone actually hosts the largest concentration of hydrothermal explosion craters found anywhere on the planet, physical evidence of this exact process playing out repeatedly over thousands of years. Mary Bay, on the shore of Yellowstone Lake, contains a crater roughly 1.5 miles across. It's the product of a hydrothermal explosion researchers estimate occurred somewhere between 13,000 and 8,000 years ago, making it one of the largest confirmed hydrothermal explosions anywhere in the geologic record. For comparison, the explosive force behind a crater of that scale would have dwarfed the June 2026 Biscuit Basin event by an almost incomprehensible margin. It would have thrown rock and debris across a far wider area than a modern hydrothermal explosion in the basin has come anywhere close to producing. That scale difference matters because it illustrates the genuinely wide range of intensity these hydrothermal events can span. This ranges from small, localized incidents like this year's Biscuit Basin explosion, disruptive but geographically contained, all the way up to prehistoric events large enough to reshape the landscape of an entire lakeshore. More recent history includes plenty of smaller-scale examples, closer to what happened at Biscuit Basin this year. A notable explosion at Porkchop Geyser in 1989 dramatically altered that feature permanently. Smaller hydrothermal events occur across the park's various geyser basins on a fairly regular basis, most too minor to draw significant public attention. What made both the 2024 Biscuit Basin explosion and this year's follow-up event notable enough to make headlines wasn't that hydrothermal explosions are unusual for Yellowstone. It's that this specific location has now produced 2 disruptive events within a relatively short window. This is precisely why Poland's team continues describing activity at Black Diamond Pool, specifically as decidedly unpredictable, rather than settling into any kind of newly established, easily forecastable pattern. Individually, each of these developments sounds like it could be cause for concern. Ground rising across nearly 20 square miles, a second hydrothermal explosion at the same basin within 2 years, a completely reworked understanding of the volcano's deep plumbing system, tens of thousands of previously hidden earthquakes suddenly appearing in the record. Together, viewed the way volcanologists studying this system are actually viewing them, they tell a very different story. It's a volcanic system that science is only now beginning to understand with real precision, not one that's suddenly become more dangerous or more active than it's been throughout the entire period of modern monitoring. The baseline numbers here remain genuinely important context. Yellowstone typically experiences somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 earthquakes in a given year, the overwhelming majority far too small to be felt by anyone. In June 2026 specifically, the park recorded 118 located earthquakes, with the largest reaching only magnitude 2.4, comfortably within normal background activity. The park's official volcano alert level remains at normal, with an aviation color code of green, the lowest categories on both respective scales. The most recent comprehensive USGS assessment of Yellowstone's actual magma chamber, published in 2025, found that it currently contains a comparatively low proportion of molten rock. That's enough to sustain the kind of ongoing hydrothermal and geothermal activity the park is famous for, but not remotely close to the volume or configuration associated with the kind of buildup that would precede an actual eruption. It's worth being specific about this because it's the detail that should genuinely reassure anyone worried by headlines using words like new phase. Yellowstone's current monitoring network includes 46 seismometers and 26 GPS stations scattered across the region, backed up by multiple satellite passes collecting deformation data every single day. Researchers studying the system are clear that a genuine eruption precursory earthquake swarm would look categorically different from anything currently being recorded. That would mean sustained, escalating earthquake magnitudes reaching into the magnitude 4 range and beyond, and persistent harmonic tremor, a very specific, sustained seismic signature associated with actively moving magma or fluid. It would also mean rapid ground uplift measured in meters rather than inches, and significant dramatic shifts in the chemistry of gases being released from the ground. With the current monitoring density in place, scientists are confident that signals like these would be detected with years of genuine lead time before any actual eruption, not days or weeks. The current USGS estimate for the annual probability of a Yellowstone supereruption sits at roughly 1 in 730,000. That figure hasn't moved because of anything described in this video. The uplift, the hydrothermal explosion, the reworked mantle model, none of it has changed that underlying probability assessment because none of it represents the kind of signal that would. So, if the eruption risk hasn't changed, why frame this as Yellowstone entering a new phase at all, rather than just more of the same background noise the park produces every year? Because the phrase applies more accurately to our understanding of the system than to the system's actual behavior. The translithospheric mantle research alone represents a genuine shift in the scientific model underlying decades of prior Yellowstone research. The AI-assisted rediscovery of tens of thousands of buried earthquakes gives researchers a substantially richer, more complete seismic history to work from going forward. And having a real, well-documented start-to-finish uplift and pause cycle, unfolding in real time under close modern monitoring, gives scientists fresh, high-quality data. That data lets them compare directly against the less precisely measured uplift episodes from the 1920s through the 1980s and the 1996 to 2004 period. None of that changes what Yellowstone is likely to do next. It changes how well scientists understand what Yellowstone has been doing, and has always been doing, underneath the surface that most park visitors never think twice about while watching Old Faithful erupt on schedule. Every few months, it seems like a new headline declares Yellowstone is about to blow. It isn't, and nothing covered in this video changes that underlying reality, no matter how dramatic any individual piece of it might sound in isolation. What has genuinely changed is the depth and precision of what scientists can now see. A caldera rim that rose and fell on a well-documented modern timeline. A hydrothermal system at Biscuit Basin that remains decidedly unpredictable, even to the researchers who study it closely. A famous geyser winding down through one of its normal quiet phases. And a fundamentally revised picture of the deep mantle plumbing that's been feeding this entire system for millions of years. Yellowstone, the eruption risk hasn't changed. Yellowstone, the scientific puzzle, just got a great deal more interesting, and a great deal better understood in a very short window of time. That's a genuinely different kind of story than the one the headlines usually tell. It's worth remembering, too, that this pattern of dramatic-sounding surface activity paired with reassuring underlying data is not new for Yellowstone. It's essentially the default state of this particular volcanic system, and it has been for as long as modern monitoring has existed. The park draws millions of visitors every single year specifically because of how visibly, dramatically alive its surface is. Geysers erupting on visible schedules, hot springs shifting color and temperature, mud pots bubbling audibly. That same visible activity is exactly what makes headlines about new phases and unprecedented developments so easy to generate, even when the underlying science tells a far calmer story than the framing suggests. We'll keep tracking every update out of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory as it comes in, along with any further research building on this year's mantle plumbing study. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it whenever the next update lands. Drop a comment and tell me if you've ever visited Yellowstone yourself, or whether any of these particular developments surprised you more than the others. I read every one of these. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.